We spend all this time talking about Ty Jerome, Cedric Coward, and all these newcomers, right? Contavious Caldwell Pope, all these newcomers for the Memphis Grizzlies. But there's one guy who could potentially have a big role that we haven't talked much about. So we're going to talk about him today and much more coming up on Locked On Grizzlies.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, everyone, and welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I'm your host today, Damichael Cole, beat writer for the Commercial Appeal right here in Memphis, Tennessee. Thank you guys for tuning in to Locked On Grizzlies with us each and every single day. Make sure you continue to make Locked On Grizzlies your first listen. Make sure you continue to like, comment, rate, review, subscribe, wherever you listen, wherever you watch podcasts. Tell a friend to tell a friend about Locked On Grizzlies. It's the all season. It's the slower days of the year or whatever the case may be, but we still have content to talk about in terms of, breaking down this roster piece by piece as we get here. Now we're in September. Like we're pretty much here now. September is the stretch. This will be the last month of no Grizzlies basketball, so to speak. The preseason games will start in October. And before you know it, we'll be talking about the Grizzlies in training camp and, all these new emphasis that Tomas Isolo will have with his system, the new coaching staff, and all these different things. So it's about to be the action is about to ramp up. And Santi Aldama right now in the Eurobasket just had a good game. We're going to talk about him, more as well in the coming weeks. But speaking of Santi Aldama, he's part of kind of this big rotation, right? And we talked about him in a couple recent episodes. I know Joe Monax recently touched on him playing in the Eurobasket. I've talked about him recently as well. Santi Aldama has become a bigger talking point. I even wrote about him over at the Commercial Appeal. And it's because of the fact that Jaren Jackson Jr. and Zach Edey, there are some unknowns about their availability for the beginning of the season. Jaren Jackson Jr. is a little bit more up in the air. We do know at this point, quite frankly, Zach Edey will not be available at the start of the season. When you size up the big rotation, you have Jock Landale, you have Brandon Clark, you have these other options. And we talked about Brandon Clark. Everybody around here, if you're a Grizzlies fan, you know pretty much about Brandon Clark. We talked about Jaren Jackson Jr., we talked about Zach Edey. But this episode on today, we got to really dive a little bit deeper into Jock Landale. Now, we talked about Jock Landale when he signed with the Grizzlies. If you remember, there was a corresponding move when he signed with the Grizzlies. The Grizzlies traded Jay Huff, which told you everything that you needed to know in terms of what Jock Landale was being brought in for, because I know there were fans on here who wanted the Grizzlies to go out and get two additional bigs, to fortify the depth. And they added PJ Hall with a two-way contract. So that was their way of taking care of that issue. But the fact that they traded Jay Huff, a big, and brought in Jock Landale, a big, was telling. I mean, you got to read between the lines of some of these things, because this wasn't simply a, hey, we need a big, let's go get a big move. This was, we need a different type of big, because you had a big technically in Jay Huff. It's a 7-footer. He had some good moments for you and was good enough to the point where he went from a guy on a two-way contract to getting, a standard deal. But the Grizzlies decided to go with Jock Landale after the Rockets parted ways with him. And now you're looking at a situation where Zach Edey's going to be out at the beginning of the season. Jaren Jackson Jr. is a little bit more of an unknown. Jock Landale, regardless of Jaren's status, but because of the fact that Zach Edey will miss some time, I don't expect it to be a lot, but because Zach Edey will miss some time, Jock Landale will be an important piece for the Memphis Grizzlies early on in the season. He's going to be an important piece, so it's critical that we kind of talk about how he's going to fit in, because there's what everyone knows, and then there's what I think could be a sneaky area of his game that we need to kind of look into a little bit more. I'm going to talk about that on on the back end. We're going to talk about that second. But first, we're going to talk about what we know and kind of what we already discussed in a way. But I got some quotes and things that I want to pull up that I found as well. But let's talk about what we know about Jock Landale, kind of what he was brought here for, right? When Jay Huff was traded, Jock Landale was brought in. There was this clear emphasis on adding a big whose game is centered around physicality. If you watch Jay Huff last season, there were a lot of good moments with Jay Huff, but Jay Huff's not so good moments were pretty much centered around the fact that he was not the most physical big out there. There were certain games. I remember they started him against the Lakers. Didn't really go well because the Lakers were a more physical team, at the time. And quite frankly, that kind of became the identity of the Grizzlies in a way. It wasn't a Jay Huff problem. It's not a throw on Jay Huff. But a lot of those more physical teams beat up on the Grizzlies because the Grizzlies had a lot of players who just were not matching those teams. The physicality isn't a problem that you usually hear about when it comes to Jock Landale. It's a strength. We talked about the offensive rebounding, right? That is an area of his game where he stood out in the past. If you go to his numbers last season and pretty much over the course of his career, this is a guy you got to do per 36 minutes with Jock Landale because he's never had a role where we're talking 20 minutes per game or anything like that in the NBA. So if you kind of round his number up to the per 36 minutes, he's averaged over 4 offensive rebounds per game per 36 minutes over the course of his NBA career. If you put those numbers on the Memphis Grizzlies right now, over 4 offensive rebounds per game per 36 minutes, only one other Grizzlies player, only one other current Grizzlies player did that last season. Everybody knows who that is. Zach Edey. Other than Zach Edey, no one else on the entire Grizzlies roster averaged 4 offensive rebounds per 36 minutes. And Zach Edey was way above that. Like Jock Landale, really good offensive rebounder, Zach Edey. We're going to talk more about Zach Edey. Zach Edey's got a chance to really do some really good stuff as he continues to get stronger around it. I think Zach Edey averaged around 5.9 offensive rebounds per 36 minutes as a rookie. Just puts things in perspective to you. Almost 2 rebounds ahead of Jock Landale and pretty much anyone else on the Grizzlies roster. But the screen setting is what stands out because the screen setting will be an emphasis in Isolo's system. And not only will it be an emphasis in Isolo's system, it's an emphasis in Jock Landale's game. And it's something that he's, done up to this point of his NBA career really, really well. We talked about the fact that in Isolo's system, you're going to see some on-ball screens. You're going to see some off-ball screens. And you need bigs who can do that. And with Zach Edey out, Brandon Clark is solid. Jaren Jackson Jr. is a bigger body. But none of those guys are really known as space clearing bigs when it comes to setting screens, like Steven Adams was when he was in Memphis. And to a lesser degree, Xavier Tillman was actually really solid at it. But those guys are gone. And if Zach Edey's going to miss some time, and if this is going to be an emphasis of the system, you need someone, again, Jay Huff, that was not a strength of his game. But you bring in Jock Landale. This was a move centered around what best fits what Tomas Isolo wants to do with this roster. That's what this move is about. Because if you go player for player, some people will probably take Jay Huff. Shoots 3-ball well, block shots. You get the Huff stuffs and all that. You get some bunch of highlights, 360 slams. You don't get a lot of that flashy stuff with Jock Landale. It's this Mr. Get the Job Done right here. And here's what he said. I'll let you. This is a story from Dwayne Rankin, Suns beat writer over at the Arizona Republic from 2023. And I went back to this story because this is when, Jock Landale was playing with Kevin Durant, Devin Booker, and those guys. And, his role at the time was pretty much centered around creating space for those guys, and it was less scoring. And I think that's kind of how it would shape up in Memphis. But here's what he said. He was talking about Kevin Durant in this quote when he was talking about his role. He was saying his role is to get him open. That's a great look for us. A lot of it just simplifies. I'm always going to stay aggressive and look to score. I'm always going to listen to this. I'm always going to stay aggressive and look to score. But I think that's probably less of an emphasis on that part and more of an emphasis on doing the dirty work and the intangibles. And to be honest, I love that stuff. That's his words, not mine. He said, to be honest, referencing the dirty work, I love that stuff. This is your guy. Now, when I say this is your guy, this is the type of guy who you need those bigs. He says he's going to look to score. We're going to talk about that a little bit more here in a second. But then you get Kevin Durant, his perspective on Jock Landale. And he said, great hands, good roller, great screener. Usually when you got bigs that can screen for you, they give you so much space to get to my spots. And usually the defenses have to react. When you look at the best seasons that Ja Morant had, again, we'll dive deeper into this. We got a couple weeks here where we can really get into this stuff. But Ja Morant, when he's been at his best, he's had these great guys who set screens. And as Kevin Durant said, force the defense to react when he's been at his best. Ja Morant's best seasons came with arguably the best screen setter in NBA and Steven Adams. That is not by coincidence. That is not by coincidence. So much of, Steven Adams' screen setting made things easier for Ja Morant and Jock Landale to a different degree. That's what they're hoping to get from him. And then there's one more thing that I want to touch on really quick before we move on to the next segment in regards to Jock Landale, and that's his shooting. Now, I remember when he was in Phoenix, he would take a three-pointer here, take a three-pointer there. Same thing when he was in Houston. He'll take a three-pointer here, take a three-pointer there. But this past season in Houston, it's small sample size now. He was 11 of 26. 11 of 26 last season on three-pointers. That's good for around 42%. That could make Jock Landale very playable. Because you're going to get the screen setting. He's going to be a good offensive rebounder for you. But if he's able to step out at the three-point line, think about it like this now, because then there becomes a question. And I think this will be a valid question if Jock Landale performs well in the preseason. Do you just continue to bring Brandon Clark off the bench? Or do you start Brandon Clark and bring Jock Landale off the bench? Let's say Santi Aldama or Jaren Jackson Jr. is started at the 4. You want the more physical presence, the rebounding guy at the 5. Do you go Brandon Clark or do you go Jock Landale? And Jock Landale can make his case with his ability to shoot the basketball. That could be a separator. We've seen the Grizzlies try to emphasize three-point shooting more with Brandon Clark, and you saw it didn't really go well. But Brandon Clark knows his game, and Brandon Clark is one of the more efficient bigs in the league when it comes to, getting to his spots and finishing in his spots. But with Jock Landale's potential as a three-point shooter, earlier in his career, he shot more three-pointers. I think he was over 1.5 attempts per game. Then he kind of tinkered with it and went down some in this past season. Again, not a huge sample size at all. But 11 of 26 from three-point range caught my eye. Caught my eye because if you get that the first 10 games of the season or so, that you survive. You survive because we looked at this schedule, pointing out how the first 5 games are all very winnable to a certain degree. Then after that, it gets really tough. But if you get a version of Jock Landale where you say, man, he's one of the better screen setters in the league. He's a solid offensive rebounder. He doesn't have to be one of the best, but he's a solid offensive rebounder, and he's knocking down some three-pointers. Nobody's going to complain about that. Nobody's going to complain about that at the 5 position. So Jock Landale's important is something I wanted to point out. He might not be the biggest name. He might not be the biggest offseason, acquisition and things like that. But because of the injury situation, because of the way that this roster is currently structured, Jock Landale will be important. There's another guy that some people might feel like he's important and some really don't. And that's Vince Williams Jr. We're going to talk about him next here on Locked On Grizzlies. But before we talk about Vince Williams Jr., today's episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by FanDuel. Listen up. NFL season is now here, and FanDuel is making sure you're ready for kickoff with a can't miss offer. Right now, new customers can bet just $5. And if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. I'm excited for football season because I got to do these same game parlays. I got some ideas in my head. I might share them with y'all as the week goes on. But that's what makes it exciting for me. But are you ready to play? If you're ready to play, download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com to get started. That's FanDuel.com to place your first $5 bet. Make sure you go take advantage of that now over at FanDuel. Vince Williams Jr. has kind of become this polarizing player in Grizzlies lore, so to speak. And what I mean by that is Vince Williams Jr. a year ago at this time, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong now, we got a comment section for this stuff. But many Grizzlies fans were really excited about what he was going to be going into the 2024-2025 season. I remember seeing it. I remember being one of those people saying, man, like, if he continues what he did in 2024 towards the end of the season, 2023-2024 season, when all those guys were hurt and he got a bigger role and pretty much took advantage of it. And when Ja and Dez and those guys played during that 7, 8, 9 game stretch where Vince Williams was playing with them, he looked good then. He was a difference maker. So we factored all that in, and then you go to the next season. And what happened with Vince Williams Jr.? Boom, hurt before the season started, foot injury. Finally gets back, works really hard to get back. I mean, the Grizzlies throw him out there against Golden State on the road. He gets out there, first game back, he's picking up guys full court. 3 games later, boom, grade 3 ankle sprain. And that's the one. That was the injury because he was never 100% for the remainder of the season. He was never 100% again for the remainder of the entire season. And it makes you wonder. It makes you wonder particularly, would Vince Williams Jr. have been much better? Would he have taken that leap if it wasn't for the injuries? Or did he just have, for lack of better words, a Insanity run where he just played well for a stretch and then came back down to earth with a bigger sample size or whatever the case may be? But here's where I stand. It's not going to surprise any of the everydayers because me and Joe Monax were very high on Vince Williams Jr. And I remember, to fault of my own, because a lot of you, shout out to you. Shout out to y'all. Y'all know ball on here. Locked On Grizzlies, y'all know ball on here. The fans know ball because I remember when I was talking about it, the idea of Vince Williams Jr. when he comes back from injury, he could kind of being, a sneaky addition for the Grizzlies or whatever. And a lot of y'all are like, no, we're not dependent on a guy coming off that long-term injury. And that's kind of how it played out. He never got back to 100%. It didn't work out. But what about the future? From what I've been told, Vince Williams has been doing things where basically he feels healthy again. What's going to happen now? We'll see. But that's kind of the message that's been portrayed to me. When you talk about Vince Williams Jr. So this is a no excuse training camp coming up for him. This is a no excuse preseason. Because the thing about Vince Williams Jr., and I think many people could agree with this if you've really been paying attention, but Vince Williams Jr. is polarizing in a way because at his best, he looks like a potential starter on this team. Shoots the three-pointer at an efficient level, could defend his butt off, has playmaking ability. That's something that I harp on that a lot of people don't tend to care about as much, but I like the fact that you have to have another secondary playmaker out there. And with what we've seen from Jalen Wells, the scoring, the shooting, I love, but I just haven't seen much secondary playmaking potential from Jalen Wells. But so you got to have somebody back there that can do it. And Vince Williams Jr. has shown those signs. 5 assist games, He's had a lot of those 5 points, 5 rebounds, 5 assists type games where he's flirted with triple doubles and whatnot, especially a couple years ago when he played the bigger role. But the thing about Vince Williams Jr. is he could be anywhere from a potential guy we talk about, could he crack the starting lineup, to a guy we talk about not even being in the rotation. He's that polarizing as a player on this team because no one really knows what to expect. I can speak all day on what I've heard, but he's healthy again. But I also could point you back to last season from what we saw, a slower version of Vince Williams who didn't have the same lateral agility. The shots weren't falling at the same rate. There were some hustle plays there, but it wasn't the same instant impact that we saw the year before where, Vince Williams comes to the game. It's going to be a plus 10 stretch in 4 minutes. It felt like a lot of times. There wasn't a lot of that. But there's still a role for that on this Grizzlies team. There's still a role for that. We saw the emphasis the Grizzlies had on going out to get a bunch of these defenders. And we see the emphasis they have on shooters, right? What if Vince Williams could be both of those things? The possibility is certainly there. And this is a money year for him. One thing that I've learned about covering the NBA, and I think I mentioned it here a couple times as well, is guys know when it's a money year in the league for them. They trust me, they know. And if they don't know, there's somebody, whether it's their agency or somebody close to them, say, hey, you got to make the bread. And you need to be out on that floor. You need to have a productive season because this is a money-making year. And it's not a free agency year, so to speak, for Vince Williams Jr. after this, but he has a club option. Remember the Grizzlies signed him to that team-friendly deal, a couple years ago? The club option is coming up after this season. And the Grizzlies will have the choice to decline it if he doesn't play well, because it's cheap. Like it's not going to be a situation where they're scrapped for cash or anything. It's a cheap contract, so it's going to be simple. Either he's not playing well and they say, thank you for your time, or he's showing them that dog that we saw from a couple years ago. Shout out to Joe Monarch, that dog from a couple years ago, or he's playing like he did last season. This time he can't use the injury excuse, so it's going to be time to pack the bags. It could go either way. I feel like a healthy Vince Williams is still a very much impactful player. Let me know what you guys think. Are you still in on Vince Williams? That ship sailed for you? I would love to know what you guys think as well. But that 3-point shooting plus the playmaking ability plus the potential on defense that we've seen with him guarding Luka Doncic. We've seen with him guarding Kevin Durant. At that price, at that number, it's not ready to give up on it yet, especially considering we know that injuries were a big factor last season. Now the question is, how do you recover? Did those injuries set him back to the point where we're not going to see that same high-end role player? Or is he going to get back to where he was? That's what it's going to come down to. We'll see. I'm going to be monitoring it, and we'll continue to talk about it. But he's not the only other wing on his team that kind of become like an unsung guy to me. And there's another guy we haven't talked much about this offseason. Joe Monarch is probably not going to talk much about him either way it goes. But we're going to talk about that player coming up here next on Locked On Grizzlies. So what's the other player I'm talking about? It's none other than John Konchar. We don't got to slow play into this point. John Konchar has played on the Grizzlies a while now. He's become one of the longest tenured players on the team, and he's on a contract. I know many of you at the time when he signed that 3-year, $18.5 million contract extension, some people were like, what are the Grizzlies doing? And he's now going into year 2 of that contract. And that contract has become a big part of the John Konchar conundrum. Try to say that 2 times fast. John Konchar conundrum. But here's the thing with John Konchar. The truth is the truth. He has been in trade talks, at least to my knowledge, the last couple of years. Could be even longer. but I do know it's been the last couple years. John Konchar has been in trade talks. I've had people, I've talked to around the league say, John Konchar is kind of, not too much of a fan of that, or whatever the case may be. But John Konchar to us, I would never be able to tell. So that's not my word. That's more of what I've kind of heard from people, around the league. A couple people talking about that situation. But in terms of John Konchar, to me, John Konchar, he just comes in, does his job. He doesn't really say much to the media. If any of you have seen his interviews, you're not really going to say too much, about those trade talks and things like that. But what you respect about John Konchar is he can sit on the bench for 5 games, 10 games, 15 games. When he's called, he's going to come in and do his job. He's going to make some hustle plays. Some tangibles are going to stand out. And, you're going to get some type of impact. Now, the reason that John Konchar has been put in that position, right, where he's sitting these many games, that many games, whatever the case may be, is in part because he's such a limited offensive player. There's not much off the dribble. The Grizzlies put him on the ball a little bit, and there's been some playmaking there, but you're coming off a season last season where he averaged less than assists, and he doesn't shoot it a lot. And his three-point shot his stroke is talking a 36, 37% three-point shooter, but there is not high volume. And it's not like it's something he doesn't know. If you ask John Konchar, I think it was two years ago where all he talked about at the beginning of the season was, I have to shoot more, I have to shoot more, I have to shoot more. The team wants me to shoot more. It's an emphasis to shoot more. And it just didn't happen. And it kind of reminds me to the Luke Kennard situation to a lesser degree, where you have a guy who knows what he has to do, but sometimes there's just physical limitations that just limit his ability to do just that. And that could be the case with John Konchar. Like, yeah, it's easy to say I need to chunk up a few more three-pointers, but am I going to get open to be able to do just that? Last season, John Konchar averaged more rebounds than points. So that just tells you that. But he's also a really good rebounder, which is why when you talk about his potential role, because, again, I started talking about the trade talk stuff first because I know that's some Grizzlies fans, when you talk about the wing rotation, we just mentioned Vince Williams Jr., but you got Cedric Coward, Contavious Caldwell-Pope, G.G. Jackson, Cam Spencer's going to be mixed into there as well. Like, you got a bunch of wings on this Grizzlies roster. Jalen Wells, as we've already discussed, that's a lot of guys who are going to be kind of lobbying for playing time. And John Konchar's route to me to playing is more or less not on the wing, but in that small ball 4 role. Now, I want to mention that role because of what we talked about earlier, the injuries in the front court. If there's no, hypothetical speaking, let's say you don't have Jaren Jackson Jr. at the beginning of the season. You don't have Zach Edey at the end of the season. Now you got Santi Aldama in the starting lineup. Now you got Brandon Clark and Jock Landale playing. There's one more spot at that power forward center because 3 guys technically could operate between those spots, between Jock Landale, Brandon Clark, and Santi Aldama. But again, I ain't ready to see a Jock Landale, Brandon Clark pairing unless what we talked about late in that first segment, Jock Landale's knocking down 3-pointers at 37, 38, 39%. Then you could throw him in BC out there and have some fun with it. But if he's not going to be shooting it, and BC's not going to be shooting it, and the paint's going to be clogged up for Ja Morant, it's going to be a problem. The paint's going to be clogged up for Jaren Jackson Jr. when he tries to drive, and there's double teams all over the place. It's going to be a problem. It's going to be a problem because the Grizzlies are going to struggle. They're going to struggle if that's the case. But if you use that small ball 4 role for a guy like John Konchar, I think you're potentially looking at the option of having a player who could really be impactful, a player who has shown he can rebound the basketball. He can shoot it when he's open. I think there's a better chance of him being open at the 4 than at 3 because you're probably going to be going against defenders who aren't as mobile. And for a guy like John Konchar, who's a really good athlete, he can get into some space, get away from some of those slower players. He can knock down some shots. The rebounding, we know what it is. I think you put him in a small ball 4 role, he's going to find the ball. He's going to rebound the basketball. He has really good instincts. Right now, again, I've talked about the fact that Gigi Jackson, to me, is better at the 4 than he is at the 3. Those are the two guys. Like if Jaren Jackson Jr. and Zach Edey are out, Santi starting, you got Jock Landale, Brandon Clark. It's like, who's going to play that backup 4 role? Gigi Jackson, John Konchar are the two names that come to mind for me. Those are the two names. And at that point, it's either you go with the younger, more talented, Gigi Jackson with the high-end upside, or you go with John Konchar, who's going to rebound it, which is going to be an emphasis. He's probably not, it's not the most high upside there, but he's going to play his role in particular, and he's going to do, exactly what he has to do in order to, stay on the floor. That's kind of been the name of John Konchar's game, over the last few seasons. So that's kind of what I expect in a row. But thank you for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen today. For your second listen, find the Locked On NBA podcast where there is no offseason. Doug, Matt, and Hayes keep you up to date on contract negotiations, rumors, and everything you need to be the most informed NBA fan. Find Locked On NBA on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team each and every single day. Appreciate you guys for tuning in to Locked On Grizzlies with me on today. Joe Mullinax will be with you on the next episode of Locked On Grizzlies. We continue to get through the offseason. We're almost there. We're just a few weeks away. And then the content will really ramp up as we get into the preseason, as we get into training camp. I'll be at Grizzlies training camp, keep you guys covered with every single thing going on that end. But until next time, remember again that Locked On Grizzlies is free and available wherever you get your podcast. I'm Damichael Cole, and we'll see you on Locked On Grizzlies.